This is Scenic Roots Talking Writing. Our guest is Douglas Wolk, whose book, All of the Marvels, A Journey to the Ends of the Biggest Story Ever Told, is, as the publisher put it, the first ever full reckoning with Marvel Comics' interconnected 500,000-page story. It goes on to say, a revelatory guide to the epic of epics, the past 60 years of American culture, captured in comics and analyzed and celebrated by a beloved authority on the subject. Douglas Wolk has read 27,000 plus Marvel superhero comics. He may not be the only person to have done it, but I suspect he's one of only a few who could claim to have read every one of the Marvel comics since they began publishing them in the early 1960s, at least the way we know them now. Reviewing the book for the New York Times Book Review, Junot Diaz wrote, "Brilliant, eccentric, moving, and wholly wonderful. Wolk proves to be the perfect guide for this type of adventure. Nimble, learned, funny, and sincere. All of the Marvels is magnificently marvelous. Wolk's work will invite many more alliterative superlatives," he wrote. "Deserves them all." Why did you decide to write about Marvel and not DC?
Why Marvel and not DC? Well, you can say, oh, Marvel and DC, I like both kinds of comics. I like both kinds of music, country and Western. But the difference for me really is that the Marvel story is one continuous story for the last 60 years or 80 years. It has never rebooted. It's never said, oh, everything before this point doesn't count. It's all been going continuously since then, and it has that weight, that force of history behind everything. Like, if you read a new comic, there is this massive history behind it that, even if it's not directly referred to, informs the story. And that's fascinating to me.
I have to tell you, I grew up in London, so my experience with comics is, well, with American comics, is kind of scattered. I loved them, but they were hard to find, and I didn't come across them very often, and it was really frustrating to read them because they always, ended with a cliffhanger, which I was never able to resolve because I never saw another issue of whatever. For some reason, we used to get a lot of Superman comics. I think I saw those more than anything else. And so, based on that very limited exposure, my impression, especially looking at some of the Marvel comics after looking at your book, the Marvel stuff seems to be a lot darker.
It could be. It could be very dark. It could also be very light and very playful. I actually had early experience with British comics. 2000 AD was a formative thing for me. And also, when I was pretty young, I managed to get my hands on a stack of British reprints of American Marvel comics, Mighty World of Marvel and that sort of thing, where they would sort of cut up the American stories into 2 or 3 episodes that would run across a few weeks. But there's always been not necessarily a darkness in Marvel's comics, but a willingness to engage with the world as it is, and the darkness of it. Sometimes, not always.
Yes, it will be easy, and again, this is a somewhat limited exposure, but it will be easy to come away from it feeling like we spend a lot of time in some of the darker sections of a given city.
Right. That's true, but you also get to see places that are not a city at all, other worlds and other dimensions, and light and beautiful places. There's a lot of Spider-Man that is on a college campus. If you look at Squirrel Girl comics, those are not so much about dark places. They are about beautiful, brightly lit places and a character who's just trying to figure out how to make the world better and make the world a less violent place.
Yeah, somebody suggested that was one of the primary differences between Marvel and DC, that the subtext in the Marvel comics, well, there's a number of interesting differences, it seems to me. So on a very broad level, the superheroes in the DC comics tend to be born that way. Superman is an example, whereas the heroes, or the main characters anyway, in the Marvel comics tend to be ordinary human beings who become super beings for one reason or another, being bitten by a spider or exposed to radiation or whatever it is. At the same time, they said because of that difference, the characters in the Marvel comics tend to be people looking to change the world for the better.
That's true to some extent. And of course, there are always counterexamples. Thor. Thor is very much like born that way, and he's a Norse god. There's also the interesting thing in Marvel of the mutant characters, the X-Men, who are characters who are born as they are, although they don't necessarily realize it until adolescence, until they get the gift that they never asked for. And that's a very interesting thing. That has to do with the way that people sort of come into their identities. And there's a big question about how X-Men comics relate to questions of identity, and are they about disability? Are they about queerness? Are they about race? And they're sort of about all of those things, and actually sort of about none of them, but they can stand in for really any group that feels itself to be outside of the center of culture, of the mainstream. And that's really interesting. It's a metaphor that doesn't quite apply to anybody and does apply to everybody in some way. And the other twist on that is that the X-Men's enemies are humans. They are Homo sapien. They are what every creator and every reader of those comics is, which also puts a little frisson on it.
That's really interesting, and I had never thought about it like that. Okay, so while we're talking about the X-Men, you wrote that initially they weren't particularly popular, but there came a point where that was a remarkably mega-selling comic. You alluded to a circulation of, I think you said 400,000. Is that a month? And how does that measure against a typical comic sales?
Of its time, for its time in the 70s and 80s, that was miles above anything else. Around the time where X-Men is hitting 500, 600, 700,000 copies a month, if you're selling 100,000 copies, it's a massive hit. 6 or 7 times that is astronomical. In the 60s, when comics were entirely distributed on newsstands, at the beginning of the 60s, the top-selling comic is Uncle Scrooge, actually, and it's selling about 1 million copies. And by the middle of the decade, when Marvel starts to make the charts with its superhero comics, Spider-Man and Fantastic Four is selling 350,000 or so copies a month. But X-Men, when it hits its stride in the 70s, and it hits its stride because of one specific writer, Chris Claremont, and a couple of artists, first Dave Cockrum, then John Byrne, then Paul Smith, and John Romita Jr., and a few others, it becomes this runaway train, and it's an exceptional comic book, The Uncanny X-Men, and it just sells and sells and sells month after month. And Chris Claremont continues writing this series for 15 years straight. He talks about it like it's a novel. He says, my 15 years on this series was a novel. It's not. A novel, you can go back and revise earlier parts. With a serial story like this, once an episode is out, it's out. You can't go back and fix the earlier parts later. But it's a fantastic kind of improvisation, a collective improvisation over 15 years or so, with characters who are deep and realized and meaningful, and people came to identify with very, very, very strongly. That period from 1975 to 1991 of X-Men still has echoes in X-Men comics that are coming out this week.
Is your relationship to the comics, listening to you talking, I know that you really like music, and a lot of when people are particular fans of music, you tend to have some kind of parasocial relationship with the people who make the music, whether it be the performers or the writers or the producers, whatever. And I'm wondering if your relationship to the comics is as much your relationship in a sort of metaphoric sense with the person writing it, or it's with the characters in the comic.
That is a very good question, and it's a complicated question. There's a friend of mine, the poet Stephanie Burt, who said, who is the character you identify with most? And I said, Stephanie, I don't really specifically identify much with any of these characters. Like, I take it as entertainment, and I'm interested in them, and I admire them. The creators are particularly important to me. There are particular creators I follow. But the other interesting thing about comics as a medium is that parasocial relationship bleeds into social relationships very, very easily. There's a lot of interaction between readers and creators. And in fact, if you look at the letter columns that were printed in Fantastic Four and Spider-Man in the 1960s, you see one familiar name after another showing up as kids who are writing in letters. And it's the next person who became the editor-in-chief of Marvel, and the person who went on to start the biggest mail-order comics company in America. And name after name after name who went on to write and draw comics for Marvel years later, who were writing at the beginning. George R.R. Martin's first published work was a letter to Fantastic Four when he was 14 years old and had only one R in his name. He was George R. Martin. And what you see is Stan Lee is in these letter columns being very, very chummy with everybody who writes in, and sort of giving the impression, join the Merry Marvel Marching Society. You too could be part of this grand social experiment. And that's obviously a lie, right? But it also turned out to be true.
Well, since you brought up Stan Lee, he's an interesting person, isn't he? My impression from your book, so they started publishing Marvel comics in the 1930s, late 1930s, is that true?
Yeah. There was a series called Marvel Comics that was published by a company that kept changing its name. Marvel was one of its names. And Stan Lee started working for that company very early on, around 1941. He was related loosely to the publisher. He became an editor and then kind of editorial coordinator, and was more or less running the editorial side of the show from the time he came back from the war onward.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that long. So the first comic was Captain America, the first successful one, I think.
Yeah, the first big hit that Marvel published was Captain America, and Stan Lee's first byline was a prose story that he wrote in Captain America #3, 1941. He's mostly writing westerns and light comedy stories. And he's overseeing the line, and he develops very close relationships with a handful of artists. And then in 1961, he and Jack Kirby launch Fantastic Four, which is the first superhero comic Marvel has published in a while. The company is not even called Marvel yet at this point. It doesn't start using that name until 1963. But superhero comics were really out of fashion at that point. They'd come into existence in 1938, and then by the late 40s, they're going away. They're all being replaced by crime comics and horror comics and stuff. And DC is still publishing Superman and Batman and a couple others, but it's not a big category. And they do this superhero comic, Fantastic Four, which is also a monster comic, and also kind of a romance comic, and also kind of a humor comic. And it's all of these things rolled into one, and it works.
That's really interesting. Okay, so in the 1940s, not surprisingly, the most popular character is a superhero who he represents a sort of idealized American, right? He's a strong, powerful figure who can vanquish the country's enemies. As you say, that kind of went out of fashion in the 50s, and I thought that was interesting, what you talked about, the topics that were covered in the comics in the 50s tended to be horror comics, and perhaps predictably, because it goes along with Hollywood, this notion of aliens from other planets invading, or the horrors of the nuclear age. Then Stan Lee comes along and rewrites it again, and basically takes it back to superheroes again. But as you said, it's way more nuanced, and you have all these other elements that had been part of the comics up to that point, all sort of brought together. But the thing that I thought was most interesting that you said was the way Stan Lee started to tell stories, where he didn't write a script as such, but a kind of outline that then he gave to the people who drew the comics.
Yeah, what he called the Marvel method. And for working with various artists, what he would do was, sometimes he'd write a written plot. Sometimes he would just talk to them about what the story might be, or act out the story for them. Like, there are stories of him standing up on his desk and acting out all the parts. Or he'd just give them an idea for what it should be. Or in the case of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, after the first couple of years, he would just leave it up to them altogether. They were coming up with the plots, they were drawing it, and then they would deliver it to him, and he would add dialogue and captions. And for some artists, that was incredibly liberating, incredibly freeing. They no longer had somebody who was not a visual artist dictating staging and pacing and all of this, and they could figure it out for themselves. And for some of them, it was like, wait, so I'm doing all the work and you're getting the credit and getting paid for it? There's an amazing book called Stuff Said that came out a year or two ago, which is all the extant interviews that its editor could find with either Stan Lee or Jack Kirby about their working relationship in the 60s. And one of the things he does in that book is when either of them uses the term writing, he puts it in red, because what they did, what they considered writing to be, was so different that each of them believed correctly that they were the person writing the stories. For Jack Kirby, that meant the person who comes up with the plot, with the narrative, and puts it on the page and draws it. For Stan Lee, writing was coming up with the precise words that you were going to see and paying attention to the language, and that was writing. And so they both considered themselves to be writing it.
Yes, you can see that, can't you? Yeah. It strikes me that comics are first a visual medium and second a text medium. Do you think that's true? Do you think the visual is preeminent over the text, or are the two equally important?
I mean, that's the eternal question in comics nerd world. You can have comics that are just images and no text and still convey a narrative. You can't really do it the other way around. At that point, what you've got is prose. I think the way that the story is shown, the way it's drawn, is so important to comics. The fact that it comes through a particular artist's eye and hand and way of seeing and representing the world, that's what makes it different from any other kind of narrative form. And as somebody who has written comics, I think I'm going to say drawing's more important.
I would be inclined to agree with you, because I think that, putting everything else aside, it seems to me that the personality of the comic is very much defined perhaps by the person drawing it. There's so much information and so much, I don't know what the word is exactly. I guess it's because our sight is so preeminent in the way we engage with the world, isn't it? That's the first thing. Almost anybody, if you ask them to describe something, the first thing they're going to do is say what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
So it makes sense that, and then what is interesting, and I hadn't really even there's so many things, to be honest, that I hadn't thought about before I read your book. The notion that, and it's obvious, I suppose, once you say it, that the comics are so much a part of the moment in which they're created. They're almost like a mirror of the culture that they were created in.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you see that in a really literal way, when you're looking at the issue of Fantastic Four from 1964, and suddenly there's a story about, Cleopatra in ancient Egypt, and that's when the Cleopatra movie with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor comes out and is the big cultural story of that moment. Sometimes you see things like during the Watergate period, there's one reference to it after another. You'll see language from the Watergate hearings showing up in the comics page. There's a absolutely remarkable Captain America moment in 1974 where the head of the secret empire is unmasked as a very thinly disguised Richard Nixon, who then shoots himself in the Oval Office in a story published 3 months before Nixon resigned. And I'm sure that in 10 years we'll look at stories that were published in 2021 and think, wow, that's such a 2021 comic. Like, absolutely every concern of that moment is going into this in ways that we can't even see right now.
You seem to have a particular affection for Fantastic Four, at least certainly an admiration for the comics. You talked about it as the first 100 issues of Fantastic Four are Marvel's Bible, the capital city of Marvel's universe. At another point, that those in some sense are the kind of the apex of the art, at least at the time when they were made?
In some ways, and in terms of new ideas per square inch, you kind of can't beat them. There are other comics from that period that I like better. I probably, my favorite Marvel stuff of the 60s is probably either Steve Ditko's Doctor Strange stories or those absolutely gorgeous Jim Steranko and Nick Fury stories from a little bit later. But Fantastic Four in the 60s is where all this stuff is coming out of. It's just Jack Kirby letting stuff flow.
I get the impression from reading your book that the 1960s was a kind of, if not a golden era of comic books, it was a time when they were reborn and became what we now take for granted as comic books.
I think that's fair to say. I think the comics of the 60s are so radically different. If you look at something published in 1961, 1969, there's just this absolutely massive difference. Still, if you look at comics from any point and comics of 5 years earlier, they start looking really different. And there are a few other kind of golden moments in especially Marvel's history. If you talk to longtime fans, they will talk about there's a moment around 1985 or so where just everything was firing on all cylinders. Daredevil was extraordinary, and X-Men was extraordinary, and Spider-Man was gorgeous. And if you talk to people about 2012, 2013, that was an absolute moment of creative flowering, new kinds of characters, new kinds of narrative techniques. Everything suddenly pounces off the page in a way that it had never really done before. I love that the golden age of comics is probably next year.
That's a nice idea. I hope that's true. Okay, one question I wanted to ask you. So, having what you just said about Marvel, how much do you think Stan Lee was responsible for that?
How much was Stan Lee responsible for
the success of the comics and the style? There's this. I guess perhaps for people who aren't big fans of comics, Stan Lee is a name everybody knows. Yeah. And there's a kind of tendency to assume that he was a kind of auteur, that it was his vision and his storytelling that made the comics what they became.
Yeah, which if there was anything that Stan Lee was not, it was an auteur. There's a sort of bit of conventional wisdom in the comics world that the only character that Stan Lee ever created by himself was Stan Lee. like the the huckster with the glasses and the mustache, who, the avuncular sort of let me sell you on this thing, kid character. Like that was his creation. It was the artists he worked with who were doing a great deal of the heavy lifting. At the same time, he was the editor of the line. He was the person who was the creative stoker of the fire. The fire was not his, but he stoked the fire. And Steve Ditko described him once, I believe, as the greatest public relations person comics have ever had. He was absolutely wonderful at selling this stuff, and a big part of comics is commerce. Like, it has always been the commercial enterprise, and he was fantastically far-sighted at selling the whole thing, selling the creators, putting his name in lights, making sure that everybody else's names were in lights too. That's special, and that's his accomplishment. The creation of these characters, the creation of these plots and environments like that he gets a lot too much credit for that. But he maybe even doesn't get enough credit for his job as an editor. And actually, his language is amazing. Just the text on the page is so clever and playful and fluid, and he's so good at giving characters their own voices in ways that are just indelible and unforgettable. I think in the book I say something like, his relationship with Jack Kirby, it's a lot like, to make a music reference, Daryl Hall and John Oates. One of them is mostly the star attraction. One of them is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It's not an equal partnership, but it's a partnership where without one of them, the magic doesn't happen.
Absolutely. And it occurs to me that, what you were talking about, that it's a kind of 60-year-long narrative, is clearly a tribute to the editor as much as it is to the people who created any given storyline or any given issue. That kind of meta view of things, where you're always constructing an arc. That's an editorial function, isn't it?
It is, and it's also a creative function. I mean, I think at the beginning, a lot of that was Kirby's doing, and to some extent, Ditko's and Wally Wood's doing.
Gotcha.
It was never meant to be a giant story from the beginning, and it just became one. It came together that way, magically.
I love what you said when responding to a question from somebody who said, well, I really don't have time to read all these comics. Tell me the ones I really need to read, and let me skip all the filler, and we'll just give me the exciting bits, and I'll read those. And you said, what matters is the journey. And it seems to me that could possibly be a subtitle for your book. That what you are celebrating is this incredible journey that you've had with these comics.
Yeah, very true. Very much so.
What is it? 27,000 issues?
Yeah, and counting. Like, I thought I was going to stop when I came to the end, and I was like, okay, yeah, I'll have some time to read all these prose books. Maybe a little too much overdosing on comics here. Then the day I turned in the final version, the manuscript, I went to my local comic book store, and I was like, oh, there's a new issue of Hellions out. Okay, I got to get that.
How much time do you spend reading comics?
Kind of a lot. But it's kind of my job,
Well, the cool thing is, too, that you got to share it with your son. Is he still interested?
He is. He and I and my wife still read a comic together every night. That's kind of our family ritual now.
Oh, that's so cool. How did you get enough distance to be able to write about it the way you have? You write about it from an analytical perspective, but clearly talking to you, you're first and foremost a fan.
I am a fan, but I'm also, I've been an arts critic for 25, 30 years now. And so I'm always seeing things on a level of like, how does this work? How does this function? What's the context for this? At the same time as I'm reading it, it's like, this is awesome. I'm into this.
So I can relate to that. I think for many people who do what we do, There's comes a point where you just can't stay engaged any longer. But you've stayed engaged your whole life.
I'm so happy about that.
The journey continues to be a fascination for you.
Indeed.
So much fun talking to you, Douglas, and I think we came to a closing point, so thanks so much for taking the time. It was really it was fun to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. This is delightful. And please let me know if there's anything else I can do to be helpful.
I'll do it. Thanks again.
Right.
The book by Douglas Wolk is All of the Marvels, a journey to the ends of the biggest story ever told. On listener-supported public radio, this is Talking Writing.
On Scenic Roots on WUTC.